International. Of course, those guys have their own website, creation.com, where you can get all your questions answered. But we feel that if you have a good question, why don't you send it through to us? Because Dr. John can answer it, and chances are there's a lot of other people that have the same question. And good morning to you, Dr. John.
Good morning, Mick.
It's great to have you back here again. And of course, last week we had Trish send us a message basically saying, thank you and love what you're doing, and talk about climate change a bit more. And thank you so much for speaking in a language that she understands. That's really cool. And as far as climate change is concerned, Dr. John, I'd like to point out one of the media stories that I've seen in the last week. And this one was Science Alert. The headline was, "Here's what would happen if all the ice on Earth melted overnight." 99% of all freshwater ice on Earth is sitting on top of Greenland and Antarctica. And each year, a little bit more of it melts into the ocean. Normally, it would take hundreds of thousands of years for it all to melt away. But what if something happened that caused a massive global melt overnight? Well, that could have happened last time, couldn't it? And as we slept, sea levels would rise by a whopping 66 metres. Coastal cities like New York, Shanghai and London would drown in the apocalyptic mass flood, forcing up to 40% of the world's population out of their homes. This is a pretty scary story, Dr. John.
Yeah, not to mention coastal cities like the Central Coast.
Yeah, all those new buildings in Gosford, they'd be drowned out.
They would, and so would we, Mick. But look, we will come back to that later on in the program, and I'd just like to thank Trish for sending that text. It's a real encouragement to know that the things that we're addressing are things that people are concerned about.
Yeah.
And it is worth exploring a bit more about climate change. Just to start off, though, Creation Ministries hasn't put out any formal statement on climate change, and it doesn't have a formal position on it. But like everybody else, we can't help but observe what's going on in the world around us. I mean, we've had the second of those mass school walkouts. Then we had that little Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, speaking to the UN and getting a rapturous reception, and even suggested that she might get the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, she didn't, but that was suggested. And of course, we've had all last week the Extinction Rebellion protests. And they're not just happening in Australia, of course, they're happening worldwide. So clearly it is a huge social issue worldwide. And we have to say, what are we going to make of it all? Now, although Creation Ministries doesn't have a formal stance on it, a lot of us have got personal opinions about it, and I thought it was worthwhile just exploring some of the issues surrounding it this morning. First of all, I think we need to define our terms. I mean, it's very obvious to everybody that climatic conditions change. That's not rocket science. I mean, they change all the time. But when the terms used these days, what they're meaning is an effect on the Earth's climate as a direct result of man's activities. And this is, of course, where you're likely to get most of the contention. And it's complicated by the fact that the whole issue is very, very emotional at the moment, so that every slightly abnormal climatic event gets labelled with the term climate change. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, if you get bushfires in September, it's climate change. If you get floods, climate change. Snowfall in North America, climate change. Everything is climate change, and it doesn't matter what it is. Man-caused climate change gets the blame. Now, quite clearly, it can't be responsible for everything, and that's something that we really ought to explore this morning.
Absolutely. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 8:15 and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministry. Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's talking to us about climate change and about how these days, whenever anything a little bit interesting in, climate news happens, we just blame climate change, we blame global warming, that sort of thing. But Dr. John, you mentioned you went on holidays not that long ago. I remember you went over to Turkey. And you visited a place called Kusadasi, and that was about 5 k's from Ephesus. And I believe that Ephesus used to be a port, which is now 5 k's inland. I'd call that fairly massive climate change. Do you think they blamed global warming back then?
No, they probably didn't. And what you say is quite correct. Kusadasi is now the port that Ephesus used to be in the days of Paul in New Testament times. And it's a wonderful place to visit. Of course, it's a ruin now. It's not a inhabited town.
Ephesus,
but it's a tourist attraction. And actually, I experienced something similar in England. There's a place down in Kent that is about 10 k's inland, but in Henry VIII's day, it was a shipbuilding yard right on the water. So, things do change. But look, I thought it worth mentioning, as you rightly said, everything now gets blamed on climate change. But we've had things happen in the past when climate change was not the word on everybody's lips. And we can all remember back in the 70s and 80s when there was a huge storm surge here on the Central Coast. And the storm broke over the haven and caravans got washed into the sea.
That was early 70s. There'd be a lot of people that don't remember that one, but that was a huge storm.
There'd be a lot of people who do. And
my dad apparently made sandbags to shore up the homes along Womberall Beach.
Well, we all saw the houses along Womberall foreshore falling into the sea. Now, that was back then. If it happened now, I mean, everybody would be screaming climate change, but they didn't say that at the time. And really, one of the problems that we have, it's become such an emotional issue at the present time that it's not easy to get accurate information, and people become very cynical. You think of the current protests that we've had with the school children walking out of school. Now, those kids haven't done any scientific investigations for themselves, and they haven't organised themselves to do that. They have been organised by adults in the background. Who are the adults in the background? We don't really know. But we do know that it's been orchestrated by unnamed and unknown adults, obviously with a political agenda, to make the school children walkout look like a protest, which of course it is, because those children have been manipulated into doing it. Now, even if their concerns were well-founded, and they might be, people have a right to be very suspicious because there's obviously organisation behind it. And as I mentioned last week, there's been no balance in the scientific studies. The only studies that get published are those supportive of man-made climate change. Remember, we've talked previously about how scientists need funding to do their research. Well, there's plenty of funding available for research into what supports the climate change issue, but not so much funding into research that would go against it. And even then, those papers probably wouldn't pass the peer review system, and they certainly wouldn't end up getting published. So we probably have a biased and unbalanced picture. Now, that's not to say it's not true, but we do have an unbalanced picture. And there's also so much dishonesty and manipulation in media reporting. Whenever you see a program on the media about some event that's been caused by climate change, you'll get this little clip of smoke pouring out of a chimney, polluting everywhere, and everybody knows that a lot of it is steam anyway, so it's not just smoke. But it's not only that as well. I think there's we saw recently the Prime Minister of one of the Pacific Island nations weeping on television about the rising water level on his island. Now, is that true? Very likely there is an apparent water level rise, and the suggestion or the implication is that it's come from melting ice caps, like we've mentioned, so that the water level in the Pacific Ocean is rising. Now, is that true? If it's rising out there in the middle of the Pacific, it must be rising along the Australian eastern coastline. It must be rising in New Zealand. It must be rising along the North and South American coastline. Is it? I don't know that the evidence for that is convincing. And what you never hear mentioned is the most likely cause, and that is that the Pacific Islands are sinking. Now, here we are. Look, I was reminded only in the last week about that. Here we are, the Rugby Union World Cup's going on in Japan, right? And they've had a super typhoon.
Yep.
But I was reminded of the time of the Rugby Union World Cup back in 1995, which was held in South Africa. Now, at that time, an island popped up off Tonga in the Pacific. And they wanted to call it Jonah Lomu Island after the late Jonah Lomu, who of course was an all-black winger. He was a Tongan. He was a man-mountain, and he was just unstoppable. And he was the hero of the Rugby Union World Cup back there in 1995.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that one of the reasons why I remember it so vividly is I know that happens. You know, when I was a schoolboy, the books that we used to read were Biggles. Now, I don't know whether you're familiar with Biggles.
I mean, Biggles, yeah.
all the kids these days would be familiar with Harry Potter, but they wouldn't know anything about Biggles. But Biggles and his mates were former Air Force pilots who were now civilians, and they were getting into, running aircraft, jollies and all of this sort of stuff. And I remember one of the Biggles books, a university professor had approached Biggles. He wanted to be flown out to the middle of the Pacific to see this island that had popped up. Right? Now, obviously, that was fiction, but it's based on fact. And we know that those Pacific Islands really are the tops of undersea mountain ranges, and the Pacific floor is very, very volatile.
Yes.
So it's very, very likely that some of those islands are actually sinking, which would give an apparent water rise, but not necessarily, because there is more water in the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, we see, this when they talk about sea level rise, it could be happening very, very, very slowly.
Yes.
And, these stories talking about 66 metres tomorrow, well, it's somebody just writing a story. The truth is, we all hate pollution. Pollution is happening. And, of course, those islands, they see pollution, on the shoreline all the time. So, of course, the fight for less pollution, I think, is a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something that the world really does look at. We need absolutely to reduce waste, and we should be embracing much more environmentally friendly policies. If you travel through Europe, you'll find that in Germany and Austria, for example, the houses are covered in solar panels. And these places have snow on them for a couple of months of the year.
Yep.
Here we are in Australia. We have the most magnificent sunshine of any of the first world nations.
Yep.
And every building in the country should be covered in solar panels. There's just no excuse for it. It should be mandated. So I think common sense would suggest that we look at things like that really, really seriously.
Don't necessarily tie pollution and climate change together, because
they're two different things. Now, as far as the Antarctic ice cap is concerned, we know as Christians that it is not going to melt and inundate the earth, because the Word of God says that there's never going to be another flood to destroy the earth the way the flood of Noah did. So that's not going to happen.
Yep. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 29 past 8 with the news, weather and traffic up next, and we'll be back with Dr. John soon. Don't forget, send your questions through to, if you're on 94.9 this morning, it is 23 minutes to 9, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's been talking to us this morning a little bit about climate change. Good morning, Dr. John.
Good morning, Mick.
Now, Dr. John, I saw a story in realclimatescience.com, and they were talking about terrifying sea level rise in Sydney Harbour. Now, here's this is pretty much their first sentence. It says, over the past 60 years, sea level in Sydney Harbour may have risen by as much as an inch. It says may have risen, or perhaps less. How about that?
It's not a huge rise.
Or perhaps less as well.
Or perhaps less. And an inch, don't forget, is 2.54 centimetres. So perhaps less is not a huge rise. And look, I think the lesson to be learnt is that we simply don't know. And bear in mind that if that were the case in Sydney Harbour, then it can't be any more for the rest of the Pacific as well, because Sydney Harbour is in communication with the Pacific Ocean.
It's not like there's a bulge in the middle.
No, there's no gap between Sydney Harbour and the Pacific Ocean.
But there's no doubt that there would be a little bit of sea level rise as glaciers and, of course, the ice at Greenland and down in the Antarctic does melt. And,
yes,
we've seen some melting certainly happening.
That's right. And they're very careful to mention Greenland and the Antarctic, because they're both ice caps that are on land. But, there's a well-known medieval warming period where Greenland was actually farmed. And I think that might be where it got its name from. But look, seriously, we have to be very, very careful not to be critical, because climates most definitely do change. The amount of impact that man has on it is probably debatable, but really there's no excuse for us not looking after the planet. And we've just been talking about solar panels, which in Australia we should be investing much more heavily in, because we have all of this sunshine that's just going to waste, really.
Yep.
And even things like water conservation. I mean, we know that water is a problem in this country. We don't get a lot of the rainfall that we would like to have, or it isn't distributed as well as we would like it to be. And we can all remember the days when councils ordered people to get rid of their water tanks. I mean, why would you do that? In a country like Australia, common sense would say that new buildings should have water tanks, and we should never have got rid of the ones that were already there. They should have been upgraded. So yeah, there's a lot more that we can do in Australia, and we're putting a tremendous amount of rubbish into landfill.
Yeah. Now,
there's really no excuse for that, and unfortunately, you get environmental objections to incineration of a lot of the rubbish that should be incinerated. Now, if you incinerate things in a controlled manner, you're going to get very, very little pollution escaping into the atmosphere. And let's face it, every summer half of the country goes up in flames, and that's absolutely uncontrolled. We can't do anything about that, and that's been going on annually forever. You know, bushfires are simply a part of the Australian experience.
Yep.
And we can't do anything about that, and bushfires throw up an enormous amount of pollution, let alone the damage they do.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that we could be doing a whole lot better that maybe the lid is put on them a bit by well-meaning but perhaps misguided environmentalists.
Absolutely. You are on 94.9 this morning. It is 18 minutes to 9. You're listening to Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's answering your questions. Simply send them through to 040 Ministries International, who's been talking to us about climate change this morning. And we've had a bit of a chat about, some areas 2,000 years ago that used to have water around them, and now they're, miles from the coast. And we've also talked about, maybe Sydney Harbour having a 2.5 centimetre increase. There's other stories that you see, Dr. John, where they say, that it's risen 19 centimetres, and other places say we haven't had any rise at all. Of course, there's tectonic changes happening all over the planet, and there's been changes happening for years and years. Where do you get an accurate sort of mix from?
It's very difficult to get a totally accurate picture, and unfortunately, when you get so much emotion surrounding the issue, you don't get a lot of common sense. And we had that text just came in from one of the listeners referring to an article in the Daily Telegraph only a week or so ago.
Yeah.
And it's very obvious that Australia is not doing nothing about renewables, as many people would be led to believe by the protest that we're hearing.
Yeah.
Australia is doing plenty about renewables, and we're likely to continue to do a whole lot more. And one of the things that bothers me a bit is the paranoia that we have surrounding the use of coal in power stations. Now, quite clearly, we should be increasing our use of renewables, but you can't get rid of coal altogether. And we have the situation now where, as a country, we export hundreds of thousands of tons of coal to China and India. Between them, they've got 100 times the Australian population. So, all of that coal is being burnt overseas. But if you listen to a lot of the environmentalists, they don't want any of it burnt in Australia, which is really a bit sad. So I think there needs to be a whole lot more balance in the discussion about these things. And as our listener rightly points out, Australia is doing a lot about renewables, and hopefully that will continue and we'll do a whole lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as far as coal is concerned, we only a few years ago heard the term clean coal. Now, of course, some of the new power stations they call it clean coal. Well, of course, the coal hasn't changed. The coal's exactly the same. It's the way they burn the coal and the way they sort of strip it of its, I guess, the worst environmental properties that tend to go up in smoke. If we use power stations that are clean power stations as opposed to some of the very old ones and sometimes overseas, things would be very different there as well. But again, it is one of those polluting things that people get emotional about. And, I personally don't like seeing beaches with all the plastics swamped up on the beaches and that sort of thing. But to try and put the two together and say that's causing ocean level rise might be a little dubious.
Yes. I don't think that's true. But there's no doubt our usage of plastic is just terrible. And we do need to look into that. And bear in mind that a lot of that is really commercial. Plastics have been used commercially because they're convenient, not because people have demanded it, but it's convenient. I mean, you can probably remember the days when glass bottles were all recycled and refilled, which we don't see any of it these days. And now we have the single-use plastic that's ends up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch or whatever. It's really very disappointing. Or in the bellies of whales, dolphins and fish and so on. So yeah, there's a lot more that the world needs to be looking at. And unfortunately, when you get emotionally charged discussions, you can't sit down and have a balanced meeting about anything. What we see in the world today is we get standoffs over every issue. One side screaming, it's got to be done my way, and the other side screaming, no, it's got to be done my way. And unfortunately, when you get that, common sense and balance just flies out the window.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Another very interesting morning. And I guess now I won't try and tie pollution and climate change together. They're two separate issues, and of course climate change is something that tends to be emotionally, calculated, and too often those stories are a little, warped. People who want a certain story pull that story out.
That's true. And look, I'd just like to encourage again any of our listeners who want issues addressed on this program, text them into our text line. We want to talk about the issues that concern you, not the issues that we think you might be interested in. So we really value the texts coming in from our listeners.
Absolutely. That number again, 0401 949 949. It's an SMS line, so just send those texts through to 0401 949 949. Thank you, Dr. John. Again, I assume you're back next week,
I
next
will be
Tuesday.
here next week, Mick.
Excellent. Well, that was Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. If you do have any burning questions and you can't wait for Dr. John to answer them,